listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Convenience stores are hyper-local businesses. They are in every community in the country. They're also in every community in the world. And today we want to have a conversation about what's going on throughout the world, specifically in Eastern Europe, with the war in Ukraine. Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is Jeff Leonard with NACS, and today I am joined by two people to have a discussion on what Circle K is doing in Eastern Europe and Central Europe related to the war in Ukraine. And joining me today is Mark Woltman, who is director of NACS Global, and as part of his global efforts, sometimes he is in more noisy places than others. He happens to be in a hotel lobby today, so there might be some noise associated with that, but that's what globetrotting does.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me. And yes, my apologies about the noise. That's the perils of a traveling job.
And our other guest is Niall Anderton, who is Senior Vice President, Operations for Central, Eastern Europe, and Ireland for Circle K. Welcome, Niall.
Hello, Jeff, and thanks very much for having me on your show today.
So one of the big story in the world right now is what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Eastern Europe. Can you give us a lay of the land in terms of what is going on? Circle K has stores in affected areas. Can you just describe the situation and how Circle K is reacting or acting?
Yeah, let me maybe take a quick step back, Jeff, just to explain to your listeners. Obviously, most people will know Circle K, but obviously we're a global forecourt and convenience retailer with more than almost 15,000 stores across the world. But specifically in terms of Eastern Europe, we have about 600 stores around that region, primarily in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. But we have 6,500 team members in those countries running the stores. I suppose things have changed radically over the last number of months. We have, since the war broke out in Ukraine on the February the 24th, we've seen significant refugees moving into the different countries. Specifically, we've now more than 3 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And that has caused major turmoil, not only for the people of Poland, but also for the people moving across the borders. And maybe I can explain in a second, what we've been doing as a business. But I suppose there's the war in terms of the actual people movement. But then secondly, then there's the geopolitical implications of the sanctions in terms of what's happened there. But specifically to our business, I suppose in Russia, we made the decision. We have a small business in Russia, 350 employees and 38 sites. We made the decision on March the 7th that we would suspend operations in Poland. And effectively, that was as us exiting the market.
You meant Russia.
But it has...
You meant Russia.
Excellent. Yeah, Russia. Sorry, yeah. Did I say that wrong today?
Yeah. You said Poland, but that's okay.
Apologies. Okay, well, I'll come back then, will I?
Yeah.
Okay. So specifically, we have a small enough business in Russia with 38 stores and 350 employees. On the 7th of March, we made a statement that we were suspending our business in Russia, but effectively what we were doing was exiting the country. Trying to exit Russia has actually been a challenge for us as a business. Primarily, I suppose, if you take a step back, when the war broke out, the Russian population were told this was a special operation, so the word war was not allowed to be used. So when we announced to our team that we were suspending operations in Russia, we said that as a result of the outbreak of war, we were finding it very hard to actually announce that to them. So we couldn't even get a Russian translator to a person in Russia to actually translate our words, and we had to use a third-party translator actually based in Belgium, just because of the troubles in acknowledging the war. So it's been a challenge. And then secondly, the government announced if any businesses leave at an economic loss, the principals of the business would be arrested. So we've obviously had to identify a way to exit the country where we didn't exit at a loss or just turn off the lights. And we've seen many of those cases recently where the likes of McDonald's, and Starbucks, etc., have actually sold businesses to third parties, and we've obviously done the same ourselves.
Wow, that's when you look at global businesses, and you think about, wow, there's so many opportunities to go into different markets. There's also so many challenges that are possible, and just the story about how you had to suspend operations in Russia is, I think, something that you think about. You hear about the Starbucks story, you hear about the McDonald's story, and then it affects all these global businesses. Now, looking at Central Europe, how were operations also affected outside of Russia?
Yeah, I suppose the biggest market, or the most impacted market, was Poland, and that's not to say the other markets weren't impacted. But initially, in the first days of the war, there was a lot of miscommunication, and we found that there was increased activity in terms of cyber attacks. And one of the messages that was coming out from Poland was actually that fuel was going to run dry. So you can imagine there was a run on the stores, and very quickly, within 24 hours, we had run dry of fuel in maybe 50% of our sites. And that was just people, consumers, rushing, panicking to get fuel. And obviously, it was very similar to what we might have seen in the UK, but this was very, very quickly driven. So we had to be very careful in how we worked it, and we had to identify how we could source the fuel. Underneath it all, there was no risk at all. The refineries were still fully stocked. Again, it was just panic buying. So that was the first initial reaction in Poland. You can imagine that. The second thing was then more the human side of it, where we saw 3 million refugees coming across the border. And there was a number of initiatives the team took on straight away to deal with that. Not only many of our team members in the country have now Ukrainian refugees living with them. I think there's one case where one of our employees has 8 people living in his house with him. So that's a real challenge, if you can understand. But taking and housing those people. But then secondly, just people coming over the border with no ability to know where to go, how to navigate a new country. It's a different language, etc. And we have many sites on the border. So obviously we got down there, and our managing director of the Polish business very quickly got down to the border to see things, and made a number of very quick initiatives. Things like, facilitating giving the Ukrainian refugees SIM cards for mobile phones so they could ring on the Polish network. In addition to that, we facilitated many transport routes. So many of the staff got in their own cars and drove down and picked up people. We also very quickly decided to give free fuel to a particular company that was doing transport as well, and driving people from the border back up into Warsaw, into the transport hubs as well. So many very quick initiatives were undertaken, and I'm delighted to say that the team took that on themselves and proceeded with it. Other things we saw, we introduced a food corridor where refugees were coming in, not only into Poland, but into other countries. We would provide them with some food, sandwiches, or a hot drink, or etc. And even just simple things like toys for the children as they came across. Because predominantly, as the refugees coming across were women and children. And as the war has progressed, we've looked at different things to see how we can help. And again, very early on in the war, one thing we felt was very important was, how could we get these people employed in our business? Because, if you're coming across the border, you've no means. People don't like taking handouts. They want self-sufficiency. So what we have done is to see how we can reduce the red tape, and also lobbied many of the local governments to see how we could take these people into employment. And it's been largely successful. However, again, just a reality check is that, many of these are women and children, and they've no daycare, so they actually can't work. So that's the first thing in terms of being able to go back. So in terms of being able to get into the workforce is a challenge. But secondly, optimistically, they all think they're going to go back very quickly, and that hasn't happened as quickly as has been expected, because they thought this would be over and they'd be back in their country, so they didn't want to settle down roots as well. So there is challenges to getting people into the workforce, and then you have all the usual bureaucracy around bank accounts and all those types of things as well. But I'm glad to say our teams really mobilized very quickly to do that, so that's great.
Niall, a quick follow-up on that, because I think it's just amazing to see what the Polish people and what the companies operating in Poland have done to support the refugees from Ukraine. It's really just, as you just said, everyone is taking people into their homes. It's just really really heartwarming to see that amount of support. I just the other day learned that another effect of the whole crisis and the whole war was that Poland had already a rather large number of Ukrainians living in Poland and working in Poland, but many of them, especially the men, actually left Poland to fight for their country and going back to Ukraine, as you just said, the women and children coming as refugees, but the men actually leaving other countries to support their home country. Has that affected you in any way too? Because I see this having a massive effect on the transport sector, for example. A lot of drivers just left the country.
Yeah. Yeah, I think absolutely. So going back to my the original point where there was the big rush on fuel, the thing that we had to get was more fuel into the sites because there was plenty in the refineries. So certainly getting that. But then there was the double-edged, the double whammy of effectively a number of the drivers leaving and going over the border. So what we had to do was see how we could mobilize drivers from other countries into Poland in a very, very short period of time, just to be able to pick up. And then there was simple challenges around, the trucks in Germany were on the wrong side, the pumps were on the wrong side, so they couldn't fill them. Just simple things. But in terms of just drivers, we've had terrible challenges getting drivers to be able to deliver fuel to the stores when there was a time of such peak demand as well. So an absolute challenge as well. Yeah.
I think most of us are thankfully not familiar with being in a war zone or being near a war zone. As this enters its fourth month, are there processes that you have in place that now to not react to things, to maybe try to get ahead of things so you can make decisions on what's important, what's vital, and what's maybe nice to do, but we're not able to do it right now?
Yeah, I suppose as time has gone by, we've been able to take a step back and look at how we can help the situation. And I'm glad to say, as a business globally, this is now both in North America and in Europe, we decided to launch a program where it's a you give, we give. And effectively, we're looking to see how customers can donate money to Ukraine. But as a business, we would then double it. So I'm glad to say that we've raised almost $2 million in that initiative. And for us, that then goes into the Red Cross, and then that's facilitated through the local charities and how they distribute it. That allows us not to react in terms of needs and requirements at a point in time. So it just allows us to step back and run that program. But unfortunately, as time goes by, a war like this does become less in the news in terms of people's front of center of mind. And even, when we don't hear it as the top of the news at the moment. So we need to think about how we can reinvigorate that campaign. And we see donations dropping off over a period of time. So we're in the process of now looking at that in terms of over the summer months to see how we can push that on again to increase the donations. But I suppose the other challenges we have in terms of long-term planning is fuel supply. And I think that's very well known. How do we, as a European nation, how do we rely less on Russian fuel? We made a decision very early on in the war that we would not source any fuel directly from Russia. And that has been very hard for us to do that, but we managed that. Unfortunately, that requires an increase in the cost of fuel. As you can imagine, it's not as easy to get it. So, and I think that we see that many of our competitors across Europe have also done the same as well. And it's very good to see as an industry we've made that decision. Unfortunately, that does get passed on to the consumer. But so far, our consumers are tolerant enough to why it's happening. So that's okay as well. The other things we have challenges on a supply chain in terms of just getting products. There's a food shortage now in Europe. So as a result, we see inflation costs there. supply chain challenges. We can no longer take products in from across Ukraine. So you can imagine, again, those types of things. And simple things, even just from a travel point of view. We can't travel down to, say, Hong Kong as easy as we could in the past because you had to fly around. So many challenges. But I think as a business and an organization, we're much more in steady state.
And Mark, you have feet on the ground in Europe. You travel throughout there to get a sense of how retailers, Circle K and others, are adapting to all the issues related to the Russian oil, Russian gas, supply shortages. Yep. Are there other things that you're seeing or hearing throughout Europe?
Well, definitely. The primary thing would be energy prices. Energy prices are up, and they are continuing to move upwards, and doesn't seem to stop anywhere. In general, you can. Well, it's a two-sided thing probably. On the one hand, you do see and realize that there is fear across Europe, because if you just historically look at Europe, European nations have been fighting against each other for centuries. And after World War II, they sat together and they made a very bold statement. And that was that European nations don't ever want to fight against each other ever again. And this is why we today have the European Union, for example. So for many younger people, it was unthinkable that a war could happen on European soil. And now realizing that this 18th century style smash and grab war can happen, this creates uncertainty and fear amongst people. On the other side, what we also see is a lot of business as usual in a positive way, looking forward, because we also had a 2-year period of a pandemic. And that meant a lot of firefighting and not a lot of strategic thinking. And now the time has come really for companies to think about their strategy, about their strategic 5-10 year planning. And we see that companies do get back to that. Nevertheless, there is a war, there is disruption. On top of that, we still have the aftermath of the pandemic with labor shortages, supply chain shortages. Inflation is the big topic across Europe, and that is, of course, driven and accelerated by everything that is happening right now. So on the one hand, there is fear. There is holding back. On the other side, there is also in some way looking forward, because knowing we have to do something now, we have to take care of our businesses.
And Niall, I would imagine that employees throughout Central and Eastern Europe at Circle K, all of these things weigh heavily on their minds. The idea of, will I have a job? What will that job be like? All these other issues, in addition to all the other issues that people across the country, across the world are facing. Are there ways that Circle K is reaching out to employees or taking in stories and just hearing from employees about what's on their mind, and how do you assist them when they have a lot of things that could be keeping them up at night?
Yeah, I suppose it's not so much whether they have a job. They're very much worried about their personal security. I think it's bigger than that. If you're sitting in the Baltic states, there's been a history there of a Russian Baltic aggression for many, many years. There's a lot of Russians living in those countries as well. So there's a natural, it's a tension that is really palpable. I was actually in Lithuania the day the war broke out, on the 24th of February. And you could see the city uprising almost in dismay. I was having a bite to eat in a restaurant, and right in the center of Vilnius, and the whole city was walking down literally with flags to protest against the war because they were worried. And many of our employees reached out to me and said, listen, if it goes wrong, can we come to Ireland? That's how scary it is for these guys. So, it's not just about a job. The job is the least on their mind. They're worried about their personal security. They're worried about their families. What do they do? How do they manage? So we obviously, we have to be very empathetic to that type of thinking and be very open to understanding that. We have a big business center in the Baltics as well, and these are just challenges that as an organization we have to. But I suppose there is always some comfort in what you hear, and I'll give you one good example. So I received a letter actually from a refugee who happened to be staying in one of our employees' houses. They took it upon themselves to write to me to thank me for everything the business had done. And this is nothing we had consciously done. Effectively, one of our staff members, for example, over the Easter period, dropped Easter eggs around to them, made sure that they had what they wanted. And this guy took it upon himself, a young boy, took it upon himself to write to me to say, thank you very much for everything you've done. Wasn't promoted, or wasn't pushed to ask, it just out on his own back. And, when we share those letters with people, we realize as a business, we're doing the right thing. And actually, we're not pushing that as a business. But what I take comfort from is the fact is we know we have employees in our business that are doing that for other people, which means they're doing the right thing, and they have the empathy and the passion. The empathy for these people that they will react, and that's really important to us as a business. So we take those stories and realize that ultimately, when the things go against, when your back is against the wall, as a business, we will react in the right way, and that's what I take a lot of comfort from.
I would imagine also the conversations in stores are different than the traditional conversations you'd see in stores in just normal times. That there's a little bit more of a glue, a connection than normal times where people may stop and check in with each. How you doing? Good to see you, and it's really heartfelt. Is that also something that you're seeing in stores?
Yeah, I suppose it's not as, I suppose on the back of COVID, we've had as a business, I think that's really gelled us much closer in terms of, as Mark said, you react and you're working in a very tense environment at all times. We stayed open during the whole COVID crisis. So as a business, there is that team camaraderie that we're in this together. And unfortunately, this is just another issue which on the back of COVID just came. But I think, it's things like how do we, I spoke about trying to get Ukrainian people into work. They don't speak the language in any of the countries we operate. So we have to put up with that. The fact is that we can't communicate. Typically, we would want a staff member to be able to talk to the customers. That doesn't happen. So how can we facilitate them to come into the business and be understanding that that's not a perfect scenario for a business, but actually understanding it's the right thing to do as well. So really important for us to do that. So that creates that type of bond and team spirit. But again, what I'm delighted to say is that as a business, when we do come against these pinch points, whether it's COVID or Ukraine or fuel supplies or runs on fuel, as a business, we very quickly react and we always do the right thing.
Mark, are you seeing the same throughout Europe?
I'd say yes. I'd say that the pandemic really has, how can I say, opened the eyes of companies when it comes to preparedness. The pandemic hit everyone in a situation where, no one could have anticipated really that a pandemic will hit us, even if that was a possibility that might be on the horizon. No one could really plan for it. But what I hear a lot from companies is that what they learned from the pandemic is we need to be prepared for things that we have not the slightest idea that it will happen. So that means we can't prepare for it, but we can prepare our organization to be ready to deal with something that is unknown. As an example, a lot of companies had big issues with communication during the pandemic directly from the headquarters to the in-store staff, because you couldn't use the usual channels that you had. You needed something that was quicker, that was more flexible, and so on, because you had to react quickly. Now, companies learned from that and set up kind of a crisis center, a task force that is made up of people from different departments that just can come together quickly, assess the situation, and then really create a plan. How can we deal with that? And what we see is that companies like Circle K, Niall, you probably can elaborate on that, but your company culture is really focused on the people. Your company culture is really a humanistic, encouraging culture, and that is driven by your CEO all the way through the organization. And what we see is that companies like yours that focus really on the people can react much quicker when it comes to a point of crisis. And I mean, with the Ukrainian situation, we definitely have a point of crisis here.
Yeah, I think as a business, actually, we're very fortunate. I joined from Topaz a number of years ago, so I'm in the business now, the Circle K business, just over 5 years. And in the first few years of joining the Circle K business, we actually did a lot of emergency response training. So we have a very well honed process for that. And sometimes when you do this training, you go, oh, this is never going to really tease itself out. You might have something that happens, but nothing like a pandemic. And in fairness, it's like I can imagine if you're on a plane and the plane's going down, you'll just click into what you have to do to get yourself ready to get off the plane. We clicked into it very quickly how to deal with this through our emergency response training. And actually, I led it for Europe in terms of what we had to do. And it was eye-opening how quickly the team came together and we followed the process exactly how it was. And one good example in terms of just, for example, we saw Poland, obviously, as we're just talking about now, relevant, but they identified this perplex glass screen. And they put it up. And I remember on the first day of the COVID thing, there was the managing director putting it up on the thing. And I said, what's that all about? And then quickly, within 3 days, we'd rolled that out across Europe. And then all of the retailers copied us in terms of this is the way to go forward. But that emergency response just kicked in and everyone reacted in the right way. And I think that's what we see with Ukraine. So we have emergency response teams in each country now operating. And then if it hits across Europe, then we work. So we were very prepared for it, Mark. I think we were fortunate. We didn't have to start building task force. And that's been continued through in terms of the Ukraine crisis now at the moment. So, yeah.
That's awesome, and I think one really critical element to that is the focus on people, right? I mean, in the end, as you said, your people in the store, they came up with the solution during COVID, and you have to rely on really building something from the ground up if it comes to a situation of crisis,
yep.
Right?
Yeah.
I have a question on strategic growth. I know that Central Eastern Europe has been an area where a lot of companies have been investing for a number of years now, because it has been seen as a really good area where a lot can and will happen, and where there is a lot of potential. Right now, of course, we are in a situation of crisis, which means it might get less funding in the immediate future. How do you see that? Is it just on hold for now, or are you already looking elsewhere, which might be the next growth region?
No, obviously, I mentioned at the start of the conversation that we're exiting Russia, so that's a divestment. So that's a very clear strategy that we're not going to invest any more money or any more time in Russia. So that's very clear as a result of the war. But we see the rest of the countries as business as usual in terms of our investment and our plans for those countries. Poland is one of the biggest markets in Europe, and we have a small market share. So we are looking continually to see opportunities. There's nothing. We've never made a decision based on what we're seeing in the Ukraine at the moment in terms of how we deploy our capital. So
yeah. And my final question here really is, with COVID, we already hit a lot of labor shortages coming out of COVID. We are in a situation globally where we have a massive supply chain crisis. All the containers are in the wrong spot around the world, and it just takes ages to get anything shipped anywhere. And the war in Ukraine, of course, has massively accelerated that, and especially here in Europe. We have food shortages. We have ingredient shortages. We can't manufacture what we want. How much has that impacted your business as such across Europe, and your choices concerning your category mix, what you're selling, what products you rely on, and your relationships with the manufacturers on that?
Yeah, I suppose staff turnover is a huge challenge for every business. And staff turnover in an inflationary environment is an even harder challenge. You can imagine the challenge you have as a business. So that's something we're working on in terms of how we adapt our model, in terms of, looking at how we can retain staff longer, but also, and that can be both financially or non-financial methods. So we're looking at that across the business. In terms of the supply chain, it's a challenge everywhere. Actually, there's some of the biggest challenges are not so much in the goods we sell, but actually in some of the longer lead time products, new ovens and new equipment for the stores is some of the challenges. So unfortunately, we've had to delay some of our programs, rolling those out across the different markets. And that's a challenge. We are fortunate enough in terms of our model that we are each individual country sources directly themselves. So we don't have any global within Europe that they have direct relationships. So again, if a problem arises in one market, it won't impact every market. So we're actually kind of unique that way, which is a good result of the diversified model we operate, which is good as well. So fingers crossed, we do see some easing in inflation. Fingers crossed, we see some easing in staff turnover. Fingers crossed, we see some improvements in the supply chain. But these things are there, and we're going to work through them. So like everyone else.
This conversation is a perfect example about how convenience stores play an essential role in everyday lives, whether in normal times or in times of crisis. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Niall, for joining us today. Thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.